Cool, cool. So, and one other thing before we get started is that we would like to thank the National Association of Science Writers, or NASW, for funding this project. We've been doing science communication and science journalism workshops for the last few months now. We're coming up to the end of the grant, and we wouldn't have been able to do this without them. So we want to thank them. In addition to these workshops, we also have been doing we started our own like online platform for science journalism and communication called B-Scientist, which was the name of our original podcast, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if you apply to that, we accept your story. We'll get into more detail at the very end of this. We could give you $300, which could go pretty far these days. So think about that as we're talking through this. And then one thing I'll say is that, we do have a small group, but we do hope you try to stay active in here because we're going to do a bunch of different things here today to help you make a podcast if you want. So that being said, I want to reintroduce myself. My name is Jordan Chapman. Again, I'm the president of Black Science Coalition Institute, and I will shout out Khalil again. He's the treasurer of B-SCI. I'm a PhD candidate in geoscience at Baylor University. Hopefully, in my last calendar year here, maybe December, maybe next May, we'll see. But I was also 2024 AAAS, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Science Mass Media Fellow at the Dallas Morning News. And then in 22, I was a Jackson Wild Media Lab Fellow. And I love science communication. I love science and talking about science. I have since Khalil and I co-founded this organization. It's been a journey and learning about how to do all this stuff. I've enjoyed every second of it. So I'm happy to talk to you guys about it today. Um, and our goal today is to talk to you about the basics of developing a podcast and then recording an episode. So this is the basic outline. At the end, we are going to get kind of creative in the way we show you how to do these things. Again, there's going to be pretty interactive. So if you need a second to grab a pen and a piece of paper, or you can just use your laptop, we will have some things that you can just do on your laptop too. This is going to be a small group, if you can't already tell, and that's completely fine. Again, we're going to be putting this on YouTube later. So that also gives you a chance along the way. If you have a question, hey, just ask. I got us here for at least an hour. But also I was planning on maybe if we had to go over hour and a half. So we can talk as long as you guys want to. Just be mindful if you got to go. We understand. But with all that being said, let's talk about developing a podcast from the very beginning. So we actually, B-SCI just launched a new podcast called Below the Scope, and that's our artwork for it in the very middle here. Um, we originally started out doing a podcast called Be Scientist, and that was a podcast with myself and one of our original members, and now Dr. Jenna Carpenter of chemistry, and we would just talk about science. We didn't really understand it at the time because we were both pretty new to science communication in general, but we were honestly doing science journalism then. And since we've been trying to develop new stuff, we kind of came back to this idea of doing a podcast, but we didn't want to do it the exact same way. So we kind of like switched up the format. So it's a lot more, we tried to make it a little bit better produced, things like that. But we took inspiration from a bunch of different places. There was definitely the science journalism and communication stuff we learned along the way. But there's a lot of creative storytelling in it too. For example, we took like cues from Black Mirror, The Twilight Zone, things like that. But there's some really great science journalism podcasts out there that also are very well produced and very entertaining, like Radio Lab and Unexplainable, and Shortwave, which Radio Lab and Shortwave are both NPR podcasts. They're great. So we took inspiration from places like that as we were trying to develop Below the Scope. Um, but one of the main things that we wanted to talk about today is also the formatting of a podcast. If you've already listened to a podcast, you know they can sound very different, depending on what their genre is, things like that. But they all kind of share some things. Usually there's a host, maybe there's more than one. And some podcasts have more of an interview style. Some are more roundtable. Like I would say Below the Scope is more solo interview and documentary, but we also took our inspiration from Radiolab. And Radiolab is more like roundtable documentary and interview. And then if you want to listen to a fun one, there might be like I know I listen to a couple of Dungeons and Dragons podcasts. And those are more like fiction. So those are out there too. But the one thing about a lot of the top podcasts that they all have in common is that they do a lot of interviews and a lot of deep reporting. which basically means researching and things like that. And those tend to be true crime podcasts, but you can imagine how a science podcast could definitely lend itself to that type of format. So keep that in mind as you're working on your podcast. People really do appreciate that type of work and effort. So you should be encouraged by that if you're thinking about starting a science podcast. Um, this is a QR code for one of the things we used to use to develop Be Scientist, and we even consulted when we were doing Below the Scope. It's called the NPR Storytelling Project and Blueprint. The QR code's there if you want to scan it right now and save it for later. But we also have the link, and again, we're going to share the slides with your email accounts later. So there's that. But you can just download it, make a new copy of it, and it's free. NPR releases a lot of their training stuff, and we'll be going through some of it today for people to do stuff like that because NPR is a publicly funded. So they do give a lot back to the community that way. So we're going to go through one of these things in a second. But before we do, one thing I want you guys to, and specifically want you guys to think about is defining your audience. This is the Black Science Coalition Institute. We tend to focus on Black audiences. That's not the only thing we focus on, but of course, that's one of the main things we focus on. And so, with that, a lot of the things we do are very much Black focused. Our messaging is that. But there are other things to think about. The age of people who might be listening, for example, most people who listen to podcasts are probably between 18 and 34, though millennials were the ones who really started listening to podcasts, so that might keep expanding as, us millennials get older. But then, say education level is pretty important. I mean, most people who listen to NPR have at least some college education. That's not everybody, but most people. But also, when you're listening to a podcast, it's important to think about how long the podcast is. You know, I don't think it's coincidental to think that most podcasts are between an hour and 20 minutes. Um, the average commute time in the United States is less than an hour and more than 20 minutes. So podcasts are great for commuting. There are some pretty long ones you can take on a road trip, but then that means you just listen to multiple episodes. So, there are things like that. And so podcasts can really fill that space. Frequency is another thing you might want to think about too. Below the Scope, we've released our first episode in March, and we were planning on releasing monthly. We're already a little bit behind schedule, if I'm being honest, but it's because we're waiting for a couple things to fall through. So our plan has been to be a monthly-ish podcast. And as I said earlier, I'm a PhD student. It gets kind of rough sometimes. So if you're thinking about making a podcast, that is something you want to think about. A lot of the top podcasts are weekly podcasts, but you got to do what's best for you and your schedule. So you shouldn't be discouraged because if you can't do a weekly podcast. We certainly weren't, so you shouldn't be either. Just be sure to think about those things and kind of just set a bar for yourself to clear as you think about those things. So with that said, we're going to do our first little mini workshop. I'm going to give you guys like 30 seconds to grab a pen, piece of paper, and then jot down what you see on the screen here and answer some of these questions from this NPR training document. Um, it doesn't need to be super detailed. Again, it's only 2 or 3 minutes, and then I'm going to show you the next slide we're going to do after that because we're going to do a bit of an ad lib. So I will be calling on people to kind of fill in these blanks here. So take 2 or 3 minutes and look at this. Each of those ad libs will correspond to a letter. So just kind of think about the things over the next 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll set a timer on my end, and then we'll come back. And this will be one of the things we kind of like cut out of the recording. So just have fun with it. Alrighty. So, I'll actually start us off. So I just, cheated a little bit, but I want to use Below the Scope as an example. So the format, interview, maybe slash documentary type of podcast need. There's not a lot of representation in Black science podcasts. And that's also one of the key benefits of it. As an alternative, though, like I said, Radio Lab, shortwave, do a really good job of presenting underrepresented voices from different communities and their stories. And then if there's an advantage is that, it's pretty unique the way we approach our stories, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we get to the script writing part. But yeah, so I can't necessarily see all the participants right now. So Khalil, I don't know if you want to call somebody out, if you could help out there.
Yeah, I don't see too many people. I'll go with Christine. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, that's me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Yes.
you. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
And
Thanks
I'll go
for
to the next
hosting
slide for you,
this.
Christine. 1 second.
Sure.
And yeah, just add in the blanks basically. Project
Cool.
title and then all the letters.
All right. I'm actually kind of cheating too because I also already have a podcast.
Sure, don't.
Um, so I guess I'll fill in. Getting Fishy with It podcast is
Cool.
it's a podcast that provides more information and like science communication for a diverse audience for people who work with who are interested in working with fish or anything fish adjacent. Um, we basically want to highlight and elevate diverse voices. I'm one of three co-hosts. My two co-hosts are POCs.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm just trying to fit in everything in here. Our key benefit is basically we're doing interviews of diverse voices and also some fun content. We don't take ourselves very seriously.
Hmm.
And our audience is anyone. So it doesn't necessarily have to be science folks. We're trying to communicate science to the general public. Um, yeah.
Dope, dope. That's really great. I'm gonna have to look that up. This sounds pretty fun, actually. I love a comedy podcast for
We've
sure.
been doing it for 3 years and yeah,
Oh, dope.
it's been good. So
And you
thanks.
said the name is Fishy with it?
Getting fishy with it, yeah.
I like that.
Dope. I do see a Dr. Jordan here, which is pretty dope. I respect that. Do you have anything to add to this?
No, no. I had an old podcast, but I haven't really. I've been considering getting back into it, but I don't like. Don't have a solid idea right now. Like I have
Hmm.
several things I'm thinking of, but like I just don't feel like I have enough to even begin to do this yet. I'm still very much in like brainstorming, thinking things out.
I respect that. I will say this NPR training document is really good for that, like helping you. This is just a piece of it. I don't remember how long it is. It's at least 20 pages, so it's got a lot for you to brainstorm with. So I definitely recommend checking it out. Like I said, we'll share the slides with y'all later. But yeah, if you need to brainstorm more, we understand. We're just happy to have you here. But
For
yeah,
sure,
check
for
that out
sure.
when we send out the slides. Um, but let's move on to the next part, which is storytelling. Which I have really become passionate about the story structure of storytelling. But before we get to that, um, just like developing your podcast, you should try to get your inspiration from as many places as possible. For example, even recently, in thinking about Below the Scope, um, I had an offhanded conversation with someone about vampires in the last couple months, and that got me thinking about blood. And I was like, huh, I really don't know what blood is for. So at some point, this year, we want to do an episode about blood and like all of those things related to that. But you can get your inspiration from anywhere. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Science Versus podcast, but Science Versus, um, they usually tackle like things that are popular on social media and like the myths that are going around, like misconceptions with that, and talk about how science. And it's like their episodes are basically science versus, like, I just heard one today that was like the science versus boredom or something like that, and they also have a pretty diverse cast for their reporters and things like that. But of course, you know, there's like the traditional places like scientific papers and scientific conferences like that. But I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but AAAS also has like this service called Eureka Alert, which you can sign up for. I think it's free. I think the only thing you need to say is like what if you're a freelancer, you're working for a news organization or something like that. But it's really good for getting a bunch of science press releases at once. So those are the publications that are coming out that day when they see it. And they send you out like one like every day, and it's even by like category. So you get like general science. I think there's one called like Med Pack or something like that. So you get those through your inbox every day. I do um enjoy that because we get flooded with, I'm sure you guys go do the same thing. You get flooded with emails all the time. But getting those, I'm like, hey, at least there's science coming out. So I respect that. Um, but once you have the idea for a story, of course you need a strong subject, right? Um, person, place, or a thing or an idea, and then a setting for that. And then every story has conflict and tension. Now, the word conflict is kind of like, can get used and abused in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be a fight against good and evil, though a lot of stories are that. But tension works a little bit better in my mind. But I think but it's just trying to capture the idea of those big moments of change and reversal that are happening throughout your story. Um, I've heard, and I'll talk about this when we get to the very end, but I'll have some resources for you there. One person named Will Storr has a book called The Science of Storytelling, and he talks a lot about how stories are constructed across different cultures and things like that. And one thing I really liked from his perspective was just those big questions. Like every story is a big question about something. And I think that works really well for science storytelling because that's a lot of what we're doing, right? We're answering these really complicated and complex questions. So and of course, your story has some resolution. It doesn't need, your stories don't need to end happily all the time, but it needs to be satisfying. If your story is one of those stories that ends with something bad happening, or maybe the story isn't finished yet, then you should lean into that. At least it just needs to be satisfying for the audience. And of course, those themes like mystery, happiness, and things like that, all those things that we're going through in our daily lives should be coming up. But of course, every story has a plot and structure as it moves through the beginning, middle, and end. And the most common way we think about that is the three act structure. This one here is a screen grab I got from this YouTube channel called Studio Binder. They have a lot of great stuff for storytelling, but they're mostly focused on like filmmaking and stuff like that. So if you're interested in doing like science filmmaking, I highly suggest Studio Binder. But this video here with the screen grab I got from this video was actually talking about one of the most famous science fiction stories of all time, which is Jurassic Park. Like, and we can basically map every single moment of Jurassic Park, which they do in the video, into this three act structure. For example, at the beginning of Jurassic Park, the hook is a man being eaten off screen by something in a cage. You don't see anything up to that point. And then in the inciting incident or inciting event, the person who's running the park goes to see a paleontologist and asks him to come to his park. And of course, it's Jurassic Park. As soon as the first act ends, one of the more famous parts in like all cinema history happens because we see the dinosaurs for the first time. Then in the first pinch point, point number four, there's the storm that comes in. And what's number five? Almost exactly in the middle of the movie, that's when the T-Rex breaks out the cage. So it's a very easy way to map things. Now, you don't want to necessarily use every story structure as a crutch, but you can see how well it works when you're using it effectively, especially three act structures. So, turning science into stories can be pretty beneficial and pretty easy to do if you really take there and take a second to think about it. For example, on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm showing the general outline of like a scientific paper. You start with the introduction, you might do a background on some of the science you're going to be talking about, the study area, and then you usually end with the hypothesis. Then the methods, results, interpretation and discussion as you interpret those results in that data, and then the conclusion as you wrap everything up. This is going to be a bit of a call and response. So we're going to kind of do the same thing we just did. So I'm going to start this time with you, Dr. J. Where do you think things like the introduction or methods, and I'll let you choose which part of the science outline might map onto this three act structure?
So I mean, I would assume like kind of basically like the same order, like your introduction is like your is going to include your inciting event. It's you're hooking them in. Your methods is like how I did it is going to be in act two, and then like my climax is going to be my like conclusion and results type deal.
Hmm. For sure. Yeah, so I largely agree with you. But you can like play around with the structures as much as you want to. For example, I think the hypothesis, for example, I think is a great like first plot point. But I can also imagine it kind of coming at the very beginning of Act Two if you like did it the right way, if that makes any sense. So there's a lot of room to mess around with these things, but it does map really well, like you just said, to this outline. So those are things to keep in mind as you're outlining stories. Now, again, you don't want to rely too much on like just having the template because you want to tell as many different stories as possible, but it is helpful to have that to fall back on when you need it. Um, for example, our second episode, which we hope comes out in the next week or so, is about Saturn and Moon's Titan. Specifically, what we did was we interviewed one of the people who is running the Dragonfly mission because he's an expert on Titan, one of Saturn's moon, and we asked him a lot about hydrocarbons. But we also asked some other scientists from Black and Astro about Titan because apparently there's a lot of people in that Black and Astro who do a lot of Titan stuff. Um, but then one thing I kind of inserted to that outline I just showed you guys is something called the false buildup. This was me trying to figure out a way to have that big moment of reversal in the midpoint, basically. Because if you know anything about Titan, or if you don't, Titan is the moon that has a bunch of hydrocarbons on it. And of course, hydrocarbons here on Earth, we usually think about as like fossil fuels. So that sounded really interesting, especially because, and I'm sure you guys have been seeing in the news everything that's going on with the rising gas prices and things like that. And even besides that, of course, fossil fuels contributed into climate change. So it was a really interesting idea of like there's an entire moon of hydrocarbons. But does that mean we're going to go there and take the hydrocarbons from Titan? Probably not, but it was an interesting idea to kind of work through. And then at the midpoint, it became like, well, one, we're not going to go to that place and get those hydrocarbons and bring it back. But we get this idea of like, hey, that's not even the interesting part. The interesting part about Titan is that it's very, very similar to how prebiotic Earth might have looked, which we can't actually see because of the tectonic process here on Earth. So, in talking to these three experts we talked through throughout the episode, we kind of go through all of that. So, there's different ways to play with story structure to get the kind of impact you're wanting out of it, basically. Um, so story structures are a great way to outline your stories. So these are some more resources for you guys. On the left hand side is one that's just about general storytelling. I've used this one a good number of times. So it has like the common three act structure, but it also has ones that I was not familiar with. So I do recommend that one if you ever get a chance to look at that one. But then on the right hand side, there's one from this website and organization called the Open Notebook. Specifically, the Open Notebook is for science journalists. So they have a bunch of different storytelling structures that people have used to tell their specific journalism stories. And I found that one really encouraging because one of the scary things for me when I first got to the Dallas Morning News, when I was doing the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship, was I didn't know anything about how journalism story structures are supposed to look like. I knew there was supposed to be like your lead like sentence and paragraph and things like that, but the idea of like structuring the whole story was really intimidating to me. So having something like that was really helpful. So I think it could be helpful for you guys too. It does sound like you both have previous experience with doing podcasts. So you guys are probably pretty familiar with doing interviews and things like that. But we will go through some of the like basic concepts and theory of it. So we do interviews as like structured conversations to gather information. And it's also a good way to fact check sources and things like that. Even if like someone is a scientist, you still need to fact check what they're saying and things like that. It's not, anything against them, but you need to make sure that in case someone says something that might not be entirely, even if not unintentionally wrong, that you kind of make sure you get it right when you're producing whatever you're producing, but also just for accuracy, because maybe they're pretty close to what actually happens, but you just want to check that. And then get new perspectives and reduce bias, of course. That's been a huge conversation for years now, but of course that's what we're also trying to do here. Um, and also just don't interview scientists. And Christine, it sounds like you do a lot of like water conservation stuff, things with marine biology. A lot of people of color live in places like that. So, and I'm sure you're already familiar with this. But of course, interview people from all walks of life, and not just the scientists, because we do focus on their expertise, and we should, but other people are experiencing the world around themselves too. So sometimes those are great people to talk to. Um, and one of the things about doing improv in this way is that it helps you, figure out the right types of questions to ask as you're doing interviews. For example, you want to usually ask open-ended questions. That way, people can explain themselves a little bit more. It's not to say you can't ask yes or no questions, obviously. And of course, like, if you had to ask, or even like one word answer questions, like if I was asking someone about like, conservation, and I asked them, well, where were you when you saw some animal? And they just said at home. That's a real answer. That's a good answer. But then after that, I need to follow up and ask the question like, well, what were you feeling like when that happened? What kind of animal was it? Things like that. And then what, just describe the animal because it can't just be the facts. Like, of course, it's science, but we want to make sure it feels like a story that people can be engaged with. So asking more questions beneath that can really be helpful. And I'll also one last point I'll say about questions is that I do struggle with this personally because it feels like I don't know I just get worried about it. But sometimes when I'm doing interviews like in the way we're doing right now and like talking remotely, I have a hard time speaking up and saying, could you restate that thing you just said? So I'm going to tell you guys, if you guys are already very confident in doing that, that you should, because you want to make sure that their story gets heard the right way. And sometimes they're not even fault. Maybe they had bad audio, but maybe it's not their fault that the audio is bad. Maybe as they're saying something really important, a truck goes by, and you should just ask them just to restate it again. Of course, again, I say I do struggle with this sometimes to make that the case, but it is the right thing to do. So I'm going to tell you guys to do it, and then hope that I can listen to my own advice. Um, and again, after you do an interview, just make sure you're like reviewing your notes, and looking for the best quotes as soon as possible. Um, just making sure you're getting all the things that really stuck out. Beginning like the accuracy and fact checks and things like that. Just making sure you're getting follow-up questions ready because you should email them if there are things that might have been as clear. Make sure you understand what's going on and what they were saying. And then make sure you follow up with that. That's really important. Um, uh, the open book notebook again has some really good resources for interviewing. I usually do start off with this honestly when I'm interviewing scientists and then like modify as needed. So that QR code's there and link will be there for you later. But I do recommend you check it out. It has a lot of really good questions to ask, especially for stories that are, publications first and then you're trying to turn into a story. Then a lot of these questions are geared more towards that, but they can apply to a lot of different situations. Um, and when you're reaching out to experts, subjects, and people who have the knowledge you're looking for, don't be afraid to cold email them. The worst they can say is no. I am pretty good about cold emailing. I will say that. But in the subject line, just make sure that it's pretty clear what you might be asking this person because, people get emails all the time. So, and usually once you put in the subject line what you want, they're pretty responsive. And then just down here, I have a little bit of a template for you guys. Just introduce yourself, say what you're doing. I recommend saying what podcast you're working for and if it's associated with an organization, say that. I hyperlink in the email to the podcast and then to B-side. That way they can check to make sure that we're legitimate. So that's a check for them. So just make sure they know that we're not, trying to scam them or anything. And then make sure you try to get that date to the interview as soon as possible because you don't want to have it because people are busy and it's not anything against you. I'm sure if they say, yeah, I'm just not busy. I'm a little busy this week, maybe next week, and then they might forget to say something. And it's usually not against you. They're living their own lives with their own priorities and things like that. But try to get them onto a call, into an interview as soon as possible and to be direct. That honestly might help them so they can put it on their calendar. So do things like that. And of course, just be professional and thank them after you send it in the email and things like that. So that template's there for you if you already don't have something like that laying around. There's that one for you. You can use this one, modify it as much as you need to. I've seen other templates online. Use what you got to use and don't be afraid to reach out to people. Okay, so now we're going to get more into the nitty gritty stuff. Um, we're going to do another very short workshop. This one's going to be like a 2 minute one. And we're going to try to stick to that 2 minute mark there. Just go around your house and record something. And then we'll come back together again. And then we'll talk about the thing you recorded and talk about the types of audio associated with that. So I'll give you 2 minutes. I want to start off my screen and audio again. So I'm gonna let you guys have at it. And if you got any questions, come back. Okay. So I'm gonna bring us back together now. Um, and I'm gonna hope you guys got a chance to record a little something. What did you guys record? And I'll let you guys speak up about that. And if it's a little quiet, I might call out some names. But did you guys record anything interesting?
Are we supposed to have our cameras on or no? I wasn't sure.
I see. We got someone. Hey, how you doing?
Hey, how you doing? Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
new.
we were just in the middle of. You came in at a weird time,
Yeah,
actually.
sorry, but I did my recording though. I
All
did
right,
do a
cool, cool.
recording, so I just copied the. So yeah, sorry. So,
No
so how do we
worries. Actually,
share
so
these
we
things?
we were doing a workshop on like just recording things around your house. So I don't know if anyone else did. So yeah, Christine, I just seen that you stick your
I
stuff off
will
mute.
just gonna say I wasn't able to actually get the recording because it I tried to and the sound went away. But one of the and
Hmm.
I guess this is maybe a challenge for me when I'm podcasting. I live near a fire station. So I was
Oh,
trying to
I
get the
see.
sound of
Yeah.
the sirens going off, but I wasn't able to get it in time. But that's something that is like a day and night sound for me is the
Yeah,
all the
I understand.
sirens. So
Yeah, I live pretty close to a street, so I do have to be careful about that sometimes.
yeah.
Yeah, I get you. Well, welcome, Josh. We did a couple workshops. We got a
Thanks.
couple more to go.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
we have talked about interviews, and then developing your own podcast. I don't know, and just to, have you done any podcast work before?
Yeah, actually, Christine is a co-host of mine
Oh,
for
I see.
a
I see
podcast that we have.
it. I got you. No worries then. That's pretty dope.
hmm
All right, cool. We got a couple other things to do then for sure. We'll get to script writing in a little bit, but just to talk about some of the things we do on Below the Scope, um, uh, are having a little bit trouble with the PowerPoint right now. Just 1 second.
Would you prefer that I keep my camera off, by the way? I don't know
No,
if
that's
that's your
completely fine.
preference, so okay.
Yeah, I was want to go. There you go. Cool, cool. So, there are different podcasts and sound or different sounds in general that you want for a podcast. You're going to have your voice tracks. So those are your hosts, an interview, things like that. But then you might have like room tone and ambiance and natural sound and active sound. So we won't do this exercise because it looks like we're getting close to 2. And I think we'll probably go another like 20 minutes at the very least. So that's just the noise that you're hearing. If you even just take a quick pause and just listen to the sounds you're hearing right now, like that is the room tone and ambiance. You kind of do want that. Usually what you want to do is record like 10 seconds of that at the beginning of every recording and kind of use that as like texture for every speaker. I found that really helpful because if you have like dead quiet sound while you're doing your podcast and doing recordings, it can be really helpful for that. And then you can just layer it as like just texture under like the host track basically. Um, Another type of sound you might want is natural or active sound. It's similar to your room and your room tone and ambiance and things like that, but it's a little bit more specific and a little bit more involved in the storytelling that you're doing. So if you are, say, in a quiet place like your room recording a podcast, and then you do hear like say a fire truck go by, maybe that fire truck works as like a transition sound or something like that. That's a really good transition sound to say, hey, we're no longer inside, we're outside now, as that like sound kind of fades into the story. Or if you're talking about like the sound of a stream or something like that, as you talk about water protection, that's a great way to include that. Or like if say you're doing like a birding story, like suddenly hearing a bird chirping kind of puts you in that setting in place. So all that mean all natural and active sound is kind of like sound effects, but like extended in a way. It really is supposed to help ground you in a story, or at least that's kind of how we consider it. Now, if you're recording remotely, there are other places that you might need to get the sound that you might be looking for. There are free places and like free sounds that you can use without any attributions, like Creative Commons licenses and like their Creative Commons searches. There are websites that do that for you. Public Domain Archive, we've done that recently using like NASA archival stuff, which most governmental stuff is free. But then you can also like pay for a royalty-free subscription to a service that way. Artlist.io is one. We use that for sound effects and for music, and it's all royalty-free. We pay for that subscription, and that helps out a lot. And they do have some really good stuff on there. I don't know how people feel about AI stuff, but they do have more of that. So if you have a problem with that, just be mindful of that. We don't use any of the AI stuff, but they do have like the video stuff for AI, which again, I'll let y'all make that decision for yourself. We don't use that stuff, but we do use their sound library. Um, and then there's the basic recording setup. There, most of the recording setup is going to look something like this. You're going to have your input, your microphone. You always have headphones, but then you're going to have some type of interface. Sometimes it's all going to be in one, like if you're recording from your phone, like or you're recording sound from your phone, like we just kind of did. That is going to be all kind of in one place. As the interface with the recording software goes straight to the storage area of your phone, basically. But if you have like a software that we'll talk about, like Adobe, and like a few slides, like Adobe, Audacity, something like that, then those type of interfaces exist too. But this is the general setup. And then there's different ways to set up a podcast. For example, this is the main one we use for Below the Scope. So first, the most microphones have some type of polar pattern or like way they pick up sound essentially. And most USB microphones are cardioid. So there's like a heart shaped, if you imagine it coming from the front part and outside basically. And then you kind of want to set yourself up where you like just do this and put it towards your mouth. And that's about the distance you want your camera to be, or not your camera, your microphone to be away from you. But then because we have like these words that have a lot of like plosives, like a podcast or sibilants like science or something like that. You do want to either use like a windscreen on your microphone, but if you do tend to do that a little bit more often than you would like, one thing you could do is just offset the microphone a little bit to the right or left side of your face, and that kind of helps prevent some of that stuff. So those are good tips when you're recording. For remote video recording, we really don't use Zoom for podcasting. It's not that you can't, but we prefer to use Riverside FM. One, because it does like a little bit of like noise reduction on its side for both the person doing the interview and the person being interviewed. And then it gives you separate tracks. Zoom doesn't always give you the separate tracks. You got to go into the settings to do that. And then Riverside FM also has built-in like transcription, which we use to write scripts. So that's what we use. I do recommend it. It's I think like $30 a month, which if that's a little bit expensive for you, fully understand, but it is worth it. I will say that it's been very helpful. Um, Another thing is like field reporting. So you go out into the field and you're looking for like more natural sounds or like more sounds that like put you in that spot that you don't have to like pay for and things like that. This is a great way to do that. But there are some things to think about, some like usual like common setups out there. For example, they have these things called shotgun microphones. And the way those work is that you just like you put a little grip at the bottom of it, and then you like point it at the source of the sound. And they work really well by capturing the sound that's right in front of you, and not necessarily things that are on the side of the microphone. They might capture a little bit on the back end of it, but even that isn't as bad. And you can like hook your headphones up to it. Usually, that shotgun microphone is attached to like a mobile recorder of some kind. And with that, you get like a bidirectional setup where like the microphones are basically pointing at the sources of the sound, which in that case will probably be yourself and then whoever you're interviewing or something like that. And it'll have the headphone jacks, the XLR cable that you would need potentially to hook your shotgun microphone to your recorder and things like that. And it stores it on there so you can download it later to your computer. You guys might already know about this actually on the fish. I forget what the name of the podcast is now right now, but what
Getting
was it again,
fishy with it.
Christine and Josh?
Getting fishy with it.
Getting fishy with it. So, and getting fishy with it, you might already have something like this if you're in person. I don't know if you guys are, but if you
We're not,
are,
no, we do
oh,
it.
I
We're all
see.
separately.
I got you. So like we used to have a podcast called B-Scientist that we might bring back one day, but when we started it, we were in person. This was very like maybe later in that year when the pandemic started, and we had two co-hosts, myself and one of our original members, Jenna Carpenter. And when we were in person, we would have a mixer. So that way we would feed the microphones into the mixer using XLR cables. We would both have headphones, and then we could hear ourselves, and then it would just be two co-hosts in that situation, and it would hook up to one of our laptops. Now, if you had a guest, everyone has to get their own microphone. Now, if you have a guest, you don't necessarily need the headphones for your guest, but it's nice to have them if they want them and things like that. But this is the general setup for having multiple per people in person. It can get complicated because mixers can get really, really complicated. I'm sure you guys have seen like music studios. Those are mixing soundboards. Those things are crazy. I have no idea how like it could be that complicated, but it is that complicated. And I'm sure like the people who have like audio engineering degrees could walk you through it. This is a lot of self-taught stuff. So with these mixers, I can understand how for like one or like anything from like two or three people, maybe a fourth person, I can understand as long as it's like something like what you're seeing on the screen here, I can maybe work out. But any more than that, it gets real complicated. I mean, you don't necessarily need any like a really expensive mixer, which is a tough lesson we learned at the very beginning of podcasting. But it does help, and it can capture some really good sound if you're going to do an in-person podcast. So that is an option. Though a lot of people are doing more remote podcasts these days. Like I said, Below the Scope is entirely remote at the moment. And then, of course, just stay organized, use good file names. One thing that I do when I record, especially for interviews, because we get these separate tracks, I bolded it here for what my general strategy is there. So if I'm interviewing a person, I'll put their last name. But if it's my track from the interview or the host track, then I'll put my name behind that person's name in the interview. And you can see above this bolded sentence or this bolded file name, that's the full interview. That's the person speaking, maybe me too, or just them. So that's the general way I try to like separate things out. And of course, like trying to stay organized on the back end of it is just having these folders that are corresponding to each type of sound. So the host or me would have my own separate folder for all the interviews, tracks that I've done on my side, then all the interviews and the people who I interview in one track, the ambi for them, the natural sound, things like that, music. And if there's archives, things like that, you might have a folder that's separate for that. So that's the way I try to stay organized with everything that we do with Below the Scope. And then script writing. This is one that I've been trying to like get a little bit better at over the last few months because we try to publish our podcast on a monthly basis, and that means sometimes we're on a little bit of a tight schedule. So we've been trying to look for things that help speed that along. So one thing that I have started doing is based off of this idea in filmmaking called a beat sheet. Beat sheets have like they're a bit of the outlines, like story structure outlines that we were talking about earlier, but they'll have like highlighted parts that correspond to like different emotions that they might want to convey. I've taken that to go for color coding and transcripts. So what I try to do if I have enough time, though in this transcript I'm actually showing you that I didn't have enough time because this is all just one color, but what you might want to do is say for all the science facts in a transcript, you might like highlight specific areas for if it's like a science fact, an explanation of something. But if it's a more emotional explanation that someone's talking, you might give that a different color. And if someone's just setting up a scene that they might have been involved in, you might put that in like yellow or something like that. So everything sticks out. Or you could do it by your act structure. Act one gets one color, act two gets another, act three gets another, and then you go through the script and color code based off of that. What I do after that is then do something called a paper edit. So I take all the highlights from one transcript that I have for one interview that I did, and then take all that, put into one document. And then from there, I put that into the rough draft. So I take all those highlighted areas. If I've done the color coding right, I kind of know where I want everything to go. And then I'll start writing like the parts that like basically transition between the quotes that the person was saying. So before I even start recording, all this stuff is down. Then I know, and then because you get transcripts with the time codes and things like that, I'm like, okay, minute 10, I need to go here and make a clip for that on the back inside of it, and I know where to put everything like that. So and then once I have the rough draft, I can go and then do fact checking. So I can go, okay, now I can go through the script and say, hey, I don't know if this is necessarily right. And that helps me reach back out to the people I interview and say, hey, could you explain this a little bit more for me? Because when I start writing the script, I can just go, okay, I need to modify whatever I think I was going to write and make sure it's a little bit more accurate to what that person was saying. Or maybe I need to do a little bit more research on that as I'm describing something. So that's a good way to do that before you even get to the recording process. You do a lot of work just right there, and it makes the entire process much faster. For example, with the second, this is actually the transcript for transcript, and then the rough draft for our second episode of Below the Scope that's coming out soon. Um, because I had everything organized, I was able to make the podcast in a few days. Like I had every like part of like the parts of individual interviews I did from one person. There were three interviews, so I was able to put that in the timeline where I wanted it to be, and then I could come in and just record later. And it didn't take more than a few days to maybe a week. So that makes you just do a lot of work just right off of this process right here, at least in my experience. So with that said, oh, actually, one more thing. When writing scripts, and you're looking to find your voice, just talk as you write. I tend to talk fast, if you can't tell. So it helps to make those little shorthands. Also, write in shorter sentences, so that way, especially with science, if you're going to try to make things accessible, having little, real long, like if you've ever read a science paper before, there's clauses everywhere, commas, all types of things that are people, might not be super used to. So you want to make sure no sentences, even more than you might think. It's not dumbing down. It's really not. It's really about just making it accessible for the people that you want to reach out to and talk to. And then you have some other ways of handling like all caps, bold, underline things for emphasis, things like that. Spell out words, spell out names, things like that. So, and then I also have a link here to the NPR training document I got this idea from, for you guys to check out later. Um, and then I do want to get you time to do this. It's going to be a little bit more involved than some of the other stuff we've done. So what I would like to do is for the next 7 minutes, I'm going to take this link, I'm going to post it in the chat, and it'll have the transcript from the interviews I did. What you're going to do is you're going to open that in one document. If you can, if you can't, just let me know. You're going to open that in one document and highlight it, all of that. So this link, you're going to go into that link and just highlight certain things based off of that color code that I was just talking about. And then you're going to move that into a different new document, either as a Google Doc or a Word doc or something like that. And then you're going to copy and paste the highlighted sections into a brief story. Don't make it more than like a paragraph or a page or two. And then in between the quotes that you get from the interview, just tie in and write some things into the story. And it's a good way for you to kind of practice that color code and kind of get into that flow. Um, we're at um, uh, what I'm actually in Central Time, so it's 3:12 for you guys. So I'm gonna shorten this. I had you guys for 7 minutes. I'm gonna say more like 5 minutes. That way we get you out of here out at 3:30 basically. So I'm gonna copy this chat or this. It wasn't necessary. It's wasn't looking for anything like specific. what was the confusing part about it, I guess?
Maybe it's just like, scenes or analogies. I wasn't exactly sure what to select for that
Hmm.
potentially. Um,
Yeah.
and then maybe dividing into like act one, act two, and act three was a little bit. I don't know if those two are exclusive to each other, like the two different the color codes, but it just seemed a
Oh,
little
I
bit.
see.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not sure how to parse these two things together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get you. I guess so. It was more so like you have options with the color codes. That's two ways I could think. So they were individual, they were separate ways you could do it. So, um, with the scenes and explanations, one, with that option, the idea is that if you don't necessarily know what the story structure you want is yet, you could just use that, highlight some things that stick out, and categorize specific like clips and quotes based off of that. Um, Separately and not related to that type of color coding. You could just do it by, if you don't want to do it by explanations or emotions or scenes, you could just do act one and act two and just go, okay, this clip here seems more like an introduction to something, so let me highlight that. But this clip here seems more like an explanation. So maybe that's like, so when thinking about our scientific like outline for a paper, maybe someone's talking about the results, and then you're like, okay, if they're talking about the results, that needs to go in Act Two. But then in the next line, or they're interpreting the results, that needs to go in Act Three. So that could get two different color codes. So it's basically like two separate systems, if that makes sense. But you could potentially use them together, but it would be difficult. So I would recommend using that color coding system, and maybe it would have been better for me if I would have just used different colors for those two separate systems, I guess, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah, that does. Thank you. I just was
Hmm.
not 100% clear on that, and that makes way more sense. So thank you so much.
No, I should have explained it more. I apologize for that. But it does help. Whatever color, and you don't necessarily need to use that color coding system. Whatever works for you. Those are the two ways I've thought about using the system for color coding transcripts. Whatever you could think of could be super helpful. And I have used it recently um when I have time to do it. Like sometimes I just highlight it in all in one color just based off what I think is interesting and use it that way and then press it out later. But just color coding in general really helps get through transcripts faster and move, and maybe the main part is just moving the more interesting parts of a transcript to one document and then to the rough draft. Even that saves a bunch of time because what you might find if you have like a 45-minute interview transcript, it's overwhelming to look at that because that's about 45 pages of just text right there. So making the decisions about what to keep and what to take out, you just need a system to flow between that full transcript to what you actually want to say in your podcast. So I think it's helpful just to think about it that way. Even if you don't use the color coding system, you just highlighting things or just even copy and pasting them into a separate document just makes things way easier.
Cool. So sorry, I have a question.
No worries.
Do you take your transcript of your interview and like parse it out this way as a way to inform how you might edit the episode and like what you might want to leave in or take out or how you want to structure your episode? Is that what you're doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because so usually what you want to do, or at least in my experience, is that you want to basically write the questions in chronological order because that already starts to give you a system to work through. So you write your questions and ask them in relatively chronological order, though, like we did the improv workshop earlier. You might ask some questions in between as you learn new things and things like that. But now you generally have a structure for the way you're getting through the information that you're getting. So then when you get the transcript, you're like, okay, I have an idea, but there's a lot here. Like again, a bunch of things that for example, the transcript I just gave you guys was from a Dr. Jason Barnes, who is like a deputy director of the Dragonfly Project that is going to launch a probe to go to Titan in 2028. There were things that, as a geoscientist, I understood what he was talking about, but I am not an astrophysicist, so there were moments where I just did not know what he was talking about. So one, like I can separate that out and go, okay, this makes sense to me, this doesn't make sense to me, but this seems like something that should go in Act One as he's explaining something. So one way for that is like he's talking about like himself growing up and why he got into science. I usually start off interviews by asking how people got into science. So he's talking about himself and he's got into science. So I should have colored that like purple or something like and based off my color coding system. But then after that, he talks about um he talks about like these like he talks about Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 getting launched into space and then a different project called Cassini Huygens. And I'm not super familiar with that and hadn't been before the story. So but he describes that as a scene and like there's another scientist involved in that. So like I took that as like if I would have used the color coding system, I would have like made that like yellow or something like that. This is different from his upbringing experience, and that's not necessarily it's a science explanation, but it's more like a scene in itself. So it's a different color. So now I have like this still goes in Act One, but now I can start structuring things like off of that. So I just start making decisions off of that. And it makes things easier for me, I feel, when I get to the editing process, because now I'm like, I don't need to like take, you know, 10 minutes of clip. I can like narrow it down to like maybe like 30 seconds and then work with the clip, which I'm going to show soon, but on a much smaller scale, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. That's a really great insight.
Hmm. Appreciate it. Cool, cool. Anybody else got any questions?
I'm trying to think if I had anything specific, but
Hmm.
um, no, I think this is good. I think this is pretty good. So I'm just making sure I understand this. So in this case, this is the interview transcript where you're kind of like cataloging things. But when you do an outline, obviously there's not going to be like so much detail when you're doing
Yeah.
it like
Hmm.
pre. So I mean, do you like to write things out so that like basically word for word you're doing things like that like you're reading a paragraph, or do you like to bullet point it a little bit more so it's more natural, or maybe natural means you're saying ahs and ums and kind of ruining it so it's
Yeah.
not.
No, I'm definitely saying
I don't
odds and
know.
ends for sure.
It's okay, I mean
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
natural.
Yeah. So I guess the process from I did show an outline earlier. So what happens is that I kind of know I was saying earlier that I like at least have a structure. I don't the outline can be more fleshed out sometimes, but it's mostly just like bullet points. I'm like, okay, in the introduction part, like, and I'll actually go back and show you.
Sorry if you
Yeah, no worries. This is I found this like the story structure part is really important. I was saying earlier that I've come to really like story structures. So this is the one I used for that same episode in that transcript that you guys were just looking at. So basically what I do, I don't know if this bar here is kind of getting you guys way. But like I have a general idea of like specific plot points that I'm like, this seems like it should go here. So I'll write like not even like full sentences. These are like sentence fragments all over the place. Like, oh, this scene sounds like it needs a description. Oh, Titan is similar to Earth. Here are some reasons why, and things like that. So I might do that, and then flesh it out a little bit. But this is I wouldn't do much more than this, honestly, because then it'd be like, well, now I'm not even writing the story, or I'm getting too close to writing the story without actually hearing like what the person's saying and take into account what they're saying. So this is as most as I would probably do, and it may be a little bit more. Maybe I would flesh out some specific things, like you know maybe looking at this outline right here, maybe I would say what the investigation was in the midpoint area. Maybe I would say, well, it's that's like, related to some paper or something like that. I do actually, that would be a good point because one thing that happened when I was interviewing all these people for the story was I talked to someone about the Miller-Urey experiment. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but the Miller-Urey experiment is like the experiment of how we figured out what, like, or at least how we tested the idea of like what the prebiotic Earth atmosphere looked like. So there's like there's nitrogen in the atmosphere, there's like methane, but there's water, and then this dude like adds a little spark to like this like vial, I guess, or like this apparatus, and then he got out like these really basic like amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. So maybe I could have like talked about that a little bit more in the script. But then at that point, I'm writing. It feels like I'm writing a little bit too much. So maybe I would have just like cited the paper or something like that. And I wouldn't probably have gone into much more detail than that. So this is, I even before this, like I would just probably just have bullet points and maybe like specific areas that I might go into more detail if I feel comfortable with that. But this is probably a little bit more than this, but not much more than this, if that makes sense.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Cool, cool. So hope that is useful for you guys. We could talk a little bit more at the end of all this if you guys are interested in stuff like that. Um, But yeah, so now we'll move on to the assembly and edit part, and then we're gonna get a little bit creative here, because it is hard to like show what the editing process is like this, but I'm going to do my best. So one thing I'll mention though are these digital audio workspaces. These are this is essentially just the software you're using to record and edit and assemble your podcast. There are a bunch of different ones, even that I probably haven't listed here, but these are the ones that I've heard about and at least somewhat familiar with. The main one we use is Adobe Audition. We have an Adobe Audition subscription because we also make science videos sometimes. So with that package, we also get something called Adobe Premiere Pro. So that's useful for us. Pro Tools, here anyway, is what usually like the more professional podcasts have. Though both of those things cost money. The Adobe subscription I think costs like $20 a month, and I take that into my account and not B-Side's account because I use it personally sometimes. Um, Pro Tools, I don't know how much Pro Tools is. I don't know if you can get it on a monthly basis or if it's like a one-time fee. Audacity is free. Maybe you guys are already familiar with it. I don't know. But that was the first one I actually learned how to do podcasting with, and that's how we recorded our original Be Scientist podcast with. And then if you have Apple or Mac, you can use GarageBand. I haven't used GarageBand that much, but I hear it's pretty good if you're trying to start out with a podcast. So I just put that there, and I'm sure there's more. I don't know what they might the other ones might be, but I'm sure they all work. Okay, I actually did when I was trying to design this workshop. I did see one called I think Soundtrap that's all on the web browsers that you might use. So that one is out there too. Apparently, I'm not too familiar with that one at all, but because I just saw it a few days ago. So that's another option if you want that option. Um, but and then you guys, because you're already making podcasts, are probably familiar with what the timelines already look like. This is usually what ours look like. There's like the host track. If there was a second host, they would get their own track, and then under each host track, there would be their own individual ambiance or room tone tracks. If they're not in the same room, now if they're in the same room, you might just put that those tracks might just be together because you both have the same room tone, so you don't need to like complicate your job any more than you might than it's already going to be because you got to organize so much stuff in the first place. And then the guest gets their own track and their own ambi based off wherever they are. And that's why it's really important to take like at the very beginning of an interview, even as you're introducing yourself to in like with Riverside FM, it makes it really easy because if I'm introducing myself and saying, well, like it'll be something like, and I just an example is I'm like, hey, so we're gonna record this. I need you to say your name really fast. And then you don't need to go into a lot of detail, just name, title, things like that. That's already like 20 seconds right there. And like without the person on the other side really realizing it, I just captured their ambi. Like I got it there. I can go back to it later and then put that under their actual speaking tracks. And it's really simple. It doesn't take that long. And then, when it's just me recording by myself, I'll just have the ambi. I'll just take a second, just won't say anything, just let the room talk basically. And then I'll just use that later. Natural sound effects and things like that. Again, that's like field reporting stuff if you want to go outside and capture sound, or if you just want to use like a sound you found on the internet, just make sure you attribute it to the place and you have like explicit permission to do that stuff. And then you might put a music track under all of that stuff. So I do want to show you guys a demonstration. So I'm going to try, we'll see how this goes. I have Adobe Audition open right now. So I'm going to share that screen and just show you kind of like what my process is. I'm going to stop sharing this PowerPoint screen. And show you guys kind of how I try to edit a podcast basically. So this is what Adobe Audition looks like. Um, before you like really set up the templates and stuff. So you can set up a template if you go to like new multi-track session because the podcast is a multi-track session. I'm just going to give this the name podcast workshop. And then I'm going to go to a bunch of folders that I created earlier. Just the below the scope one, podcast workshop, name the folder. And then I'm not even going to put this in. I'm just going to select the folder for it to save in. And then it gives me some tracks to work with. It gave me six. So you can imagine it is each of these as its own track. So you can name and rename these. So I'm just going to name this one host. I'm not going to use all these tracks because we're over 2:30 actually, at least on my time. I think it's 3:30 for y'all. Um, so I'm just going to call this host and just do one track. And then it's pretty easy to move things around, delete them. So I'm just going to do that. And Adobe Audition is a very much a click around and find out type of place. So if you aren't familiar with that, you do stuff like this all the time. And it's already giving me a little bit of trouble trying to delete the tracks. So I'm just going to work on the first one just to make things a little bit simpler. So then you just go file import and you find your file. I recorded a little something earlier. I believe I set this Zoom call up so that you guys can hear sound. So I'm going to play that in a second. So it usually comes up in the library somewhere on the right hand or left hand side. So I'm just going to drag it in. And let me know if you guys can hear this. Right now it should just be like ambiance. Goodbye, and thank you for listening to Below the Scope. Hi, my name is Jordan Chapman, and you're listening to Below the Scope. Wow, what a really interesting point. And you guys can hear all that, right?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
Cool. So this is basically what I would do. I'm going to move this up to the very top. First thing I did was I did this on purpose was I basically recorded the podcast out of order. So the end is actually the beginning and the middle part is the beginning and then the end is the middle. So I'm going to first, but before we even get there, this is generally what I try to do. Full interview just happened. Let's imagine this is 45 minutes. What I would do is first things first, there's a little bit of background noise here. But that's exactly why we recorded the first like 10 seconds of just silence of no talking, basically. So the view we're looking at right now is called a waveform. So I'm going to play that. Goodbye. So I just started talking there. I go back to the very beginning, and then I go to uh, effects, noise reduction, capture noise print. So again, Audacity is free. Audacity also has this feature. It calls something slightly different, but it's essentially the same thing. So capture noise print, it says it's going to do that. And then I'm going to zoom back out to the entire track, Control A, whole track to select it. And then I go back to noise reduction. And then I go to the noise reduction process. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play it back. And I'm actually going to speed up I'm going to put the playhead somewhere else so I can hear. Goodbye, and thank you for listening to Below the Scope. So then you can put output noise only. Hi, my name is Jordan Chapman, and you're listening to Below the Scope. So what output noise does is that it's only outputting the noise that it's reducing, basically. You don't want it to take out your voice. You want it to have it right before it takes out your voice. So, and then there's also how much it's reducing the background noise by that. So you have a noise reduction process and a reduce sound process. I want to turn both of those down because the more you apply this feature, the more like audio you lose, the more signal you lose, and the more it takes away from your voice, basically. And you might not want that to happen because it might sound like artificial, basically. And you don't want that. So I'm going to turn both of these things down. Usually it should be between 20 to 40. Though if someone has really bad audio, you might turn it up to like 60-ish, even 80 I've done before, and that has been fine, but it's all about how much sound it's reducing basically. So let's play it again. I just don't want it to take out my voice.
Goodbye, and thank you for listening to Below the Scope.
So that still sounds a little too high for me. So I'm going to scale it back a little bit more.
Goodbye, and thank you for listening.
And it's still a little bit too much. So you can scale it back a little bit more, which means I capture pretty good audio. That sounds like not enough.
Below the Scope.
I still don't like how much it's taking off. So I'm going to put it on 10 and then call it a day right there. The most important part is that if you click apply right now with all output noise only checked, it's going to do that to the entire track. So I've just lost all the sound. Lucky enough, it's easy just to push Control Z, so you just get it all back. So what I'm going to do is just go back into noise reduction process, and then click output noise and turn it off. So now
Chapman, and you're listening to Below the Scope.
And most of the sound is gone. There wasn't that much background sound in the first place, so it's fine now. And then there are weird sounds that you make while you're talking that you don't usually think about, that I, after listen to myself talk so much, know that I make a lot and don't like. So I heard one at the very beginning of when I started talking.
Goodbye.
It sounds like spit. It's gross. I don't like it. So what I do is put the auto hill. And I just take that out, take as much out as possible. You can't get everything, and that's fine. But I just don't want it to be over distracting. And also, because I was recording this on my phone, you can hear me messing around with the phone sound, or like the sound of me like moving my hand on the phone, basically. So you might want to take that out too. Again, you just don't want distracting sounds that aren't supposed to be there in your audio. So you just kind of go through, they look like icicles for the most part. That's the best way I could describe it. And you just clean it up a little bit. You don't need to clean everything, a single thing up, but you want to get as much as possible. And I'm not going to sit here and try to do everything because we are way over time. So that's what I try to do for noise reduction. The next part is applying a filter. Um, I will say that this is where I say YouTube University is great, because the filter part to me can be pretty complex. I know a little bit. I'll say, and I'll talk about that. So one thing you do want to apply is probably like a high pass filter. Though it's a bit of a misnomer because you're actually filtering out low frequency noises like 20 or so, 20 to like 100-ish, basically. I'm gonna want to put it on 80. And then there's a low pass filter, which you're like, that's confusing. But basically, it's taking out like super high frequencies. Again, I don't know why they named it this way. Who knows? But that's essentially the most I can do. And then like for specific parts, this was when I had to start looking things up online and go like, oh, okay, how much should I be taking out in the mid ranges? Not entirely sure. One thing about Adobe Audition though is it has these presets. So you can just click vocal enhancer and it does a lot of that stuff for you. And then if you click this power button in Adobe Audition, it like applies the effect as you're listening and not listening, basically. So again, this is still considers the 45-minute interview, basically. You got to do this as you get that part. So then you turn that on, it applies the effect, and now everything.
Hi, and thank you for listening to Below the Scope.
Everything's still not organized yet, but we're just applying the effects to the audio. One other thing I might do, and usually is go to something called the compression, and then I apply a single band compressor. A single band compressor, I don't know what the other ones are necessarily, but essentially the idea is that it's basically controlling like the dynamics and range of the audio, essentially. Because sometimes you're talking way up here, you're talking very loud. What the compression does is say, you're talking too loud, let's bring you down a little bit. If you're talking too low, it goes, you're talking too low, let's bring you up a little bit. So you can put that on 2.1 or 2 to 1. That's output to noise to out. That's input to output. And then there's an attack amount of time in milliseconds. Again, this is where I say there are like presets and things like that. You can do a vocal attacker or something like that. That 21.1 sounds way too high. And you don't really need that much, honestly. So I'm actually going to go back to the default uh, and just go 2, 1. And it really just takes away that, like I
Goodbye,
said,
and thank you for listening to Below the Scope.
and already things start to sound a little bit better. So if that's the 45-minute interview, you want to do that first. because now you got to like organize the interview essentially. So the first thing I'm going to do is, because I've recorded that 10 seconds at the beginning, I'm actually going to copy that part, whole thing, Control C, and make a new track from that, from like by doing copy to a new track basically. Now, this just became the ambiance basically. So I'm actually going to go over to where it saves it, and give it a new name. And you guys can stop me if I'm going too fast, actually. And so if you guys got questions, just let me know. Um, and I'm going to save it as uh, host Ambi, and go to browse and go back to the master folder for this podcast episode, essentially. Below the scope, that's the podcast workshop. Um, and then we have a room tone and Ambi folder. I'm gonna put that in there, and I'm gonna save that. Okay. And then I'm gonna go to this new track and put it under that. Now, what you have the option to do is you're going to take it down a little bit. Your ambi shouldn't be higher than your actual voice. You usually want to be about -6 to -12. So if that's where you're talking, you want this to be much lower than that. I'm going to go -35. That's now you're not going to hear it at the beginning of the clip. Or you're going to hear it, but you're not going to hear it too loud, but it's still under the main clip. So once we get rid of that, it's just going to be there. So we'll hear it again later. All right. So the next part is we made the ambi, but we know the podcast currently is out of order. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go use this like cutting tool. We're going to go to the areas and where we basically need to cut off, and we're going to move things around. The good thing about Adobe Audition and probably Audacity too, it has, you haven't used that one in a while, you can move how much you want to have in a clip. So again, I know what this is organizationally, so I'm going to move the beginning part to the beginning, the middle part to the middle, and the end to the end. And luckily for me, I actually recorded enough Omni for all of this. So now this is what it's going to sound like. Hi, my name is Jordan Chapman, and you're listening to Below the Scope. Wow, what a really interesting point. Goodbye, and thank you for listening to Below the Scope. And it's just that easy sometimes. The next thing I probably would do is, for organizational purposes, is like I would go into each of these clips here and give them new names, so I would just know which clips are doing what and things like that. Um, Another thing I would do, if there was like Josh, you were talking about ums and ahs earlier. This is the point where I would go to individual clips and text out ums and ahs, because if you're doing that for the entirety of the clip that you're working with, it could take a very long time. And sometimes you're on a bit of a time rush, so you don't want to have to sit here all day and just listen to an entire interview and do that. So sometimes, and you don't necessarily need everything from the interview that you might have done. So just take the clips themselves, and you can take the clips, copy to a new audio track that we did with the Ambi, and work with it that way. Another thing you can do, I want to move the Ambi down a little bit further now. And if we pretended for a second that this clip here was an interview clip. And I'm going to copy it to, actually, you know what? I'm going to go back for a second, and I'm just going to move track 2 under track 3. If we pretended for a second that this clip here was an interview clip, you can put that down here. And now you want to work on the fades and stuff for the podcast, essentially. So things are going to be a little bit out of sync again, but that's fine. We're just doing it for training purposes. And then in Adobe Audition, what you can do is you can control fades by clicking on this little square. And then I don't know if you guys can see it necessarily, but there in the fade area, there's like a little line. That's where the fade starts essentially. And then you can put it another one at the beginning of the other clip to where you want the fade to come in, where it's at max volume, because the fade is taking things down in volume and then bringing things back up. You do want to do it this way, and then you can kind of play around with the audio that way. And it's a good way to have, you know, if someone's talking and you want to like have them almost seem like they're in a conversation in a way, it's a good way to do that. It's also a good way to get rid of like weird noises and pops that happen, which we kind of worked it with because of the ambi. The ambi helps like kind of cover some of that up, but not everything. So this helps with that too. So this is what it would sound like. It's going to sound like I'm below the scope. Hi,
My name is Jordan Chapman, and you're listening to Below the Scope.
So it sounds a little bit like I'm talking over myself, but I kind of wanted that. And if it was a different audio track, it wouldn't sound like I was repeating myself. You would just hear the next part of
And
Clinton's
you're
story.
listening to Below the Scope. Hi, my name
And you can drift it a little bit under further just to get to demonstrate the sound
is
effect a little bit more.
Below the Scope. Hi, my name is Jordan Chapman, and you're listening to Below the Scope.
And that's a lot of what we do for the Below the Scope podcast. Again, these are all these are all techniques and inspirations from other science podcasts like Radio Lab, like Unexplainable, like Shortwave. Um, it definitely took a second to figure out what they were doing. Um, and even listening to them talk about their process, I'm nowhere near um, I'm not an audio engineer. I think the dude or one of the main reporters for Radiolab is and was an audio engineer at some point, has been in podcasting for a long time. And you can definitely tell with the way Radiolab is made. But this already is pretty good. Um, and then, there are other things you can do with the tracks. You want to balance the levels. There are different ways to do that. And we'll talk about that in a second as we finish up some of these last slides because we're going way over time. So I want to finish up, and then if you guys got questions after that, we can talk about it a little bit more. So I want to share my PowerPoint again, and then we'll finish everything up, and I'll let you guys ask some questions. So here we go. Um, Okay, so this is basically the steps I just took. One thing I didn't do actually, and I just don't have enough time for is like the mesh loudness. That's just making sure everything normalized to so everything sounds like they're about the same level. The loud sounds loud, the quiet sounds quiet, but you still are about the same amount of levels basically. So what we did was we looked at the waveform a little bit. We saw the level meters. You probably saw that in the right hand side of the screen, but you want to balance your levels. Voices are here, noise reduction process, and things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Um, remove your ums and ahs, mouth clicks, long pauses. You just want to clean up the audio for your podcast a little bit so that way it's not like it makes sense to the person listening. Yeah, you don't want to take away from the meaning of the person talking at all, but you do want to make sure that meaning comes across. So be mindful of that. So that means sometimes you just need to take out ums and ahs, and you don't necessarily need to take out all of them. Like I said, even the mouth click parts are just going to be there, but you want to make sure you take out the most distracting ones, and if you can, maybe a few of the more subtle ones. But if it's going to mess up the speech pattern too much, then leave it. Don't get too, don't be too much of a perfectionist on that. It's just a good practice so that way you can clean up the audio a little bit. And this is what I did for noise reduction. You saw that, so I won't go over it too much. It's there for you guys in the slides that I'm going to send you later. The equalization, again, this is where I say I have to look it up online to see exactly what I should be doing. Though sometimes if you're using the right software, you can just use a preset and it works magic for you without you really have to think about it too much. But this is here if you need it. The same thing with EQ. Most of the stuff is in the effects tab. So you just go there, go to filter EQ, parametric equalizer. You can apply your EQs that way. Compression, again, it's an effect. It controls the dynamics. It makes the quiet loud, the loud quiet. And then you can set the attack and release and things like that. And then the crossfades and the cuts, you can play around with this. The standard cut is just audio A into audio B right next to each other. Parallel cuts, if you imagine audio A here as like the music track and B, everything under that is like talking tracks. You can think about it that way. And then the crossfades and things like that. So I went way over time. But before I get done, I'll just say there's some other effects. There's a lot of room echo. D-reverb is the one you can use. De-essers for heavy syllables. That's this S's and things like that. Sound removal, things like that. Um, Match loudness is a whole process. That's usually you do that when you're done editing the podcast. So all of that stuff. Again, I wish I had more time to talk about it, but yeah, so I'll end it there. I will also mention some further reading that I highly suggest. This NPR's podcast startup guide, that's a whole book you can buy from there's two NPR books here. The sound reporting guide, those are both talking about similar things, but they're a little different. NPR's podcast guide is definitely for more like podcast interviews, things like that. Sound reporting is more for journalism. The science and storytelling I also really recommend. For learning how to tell a story, things like that. Um, then there's a bunch of books. Uh, you're going to have the slides, so just review them as you can. But I do want to also say, Be Scientist is our science platform, science communication journalism platform. If you would like to submit a story to us, we are giving out $300 to accepted and published authors for the work they do on our website for b-scientist.com. We also have b-sci.org, which is our main organization's website.